My own trajectory is unusual and not to be repeated by the present generation. You'd never make it. That is to say that I went to graduate school in the mid-'70s, and the graduate school I went to happened to be Georgetown University. I spent a good deal of time in Germany at the same time, where I went to study what I thought was a strict academic course, but all my courses were canceled because people were reading Lenin and Marx, and student strikes were in the air. I came back to Georgetown, the same thing happened at Georgetown. So I didn't go to many classes. Fortunately, there was the Library of Congress. I went there a lot and did research. I tend to do research in archives or in very, very good libraries. But I tend also to be of that generation that considered politics necessarily a part of what we do as academics. And consequently, I was kind of fearless. I was a self-styled Marxist, a Western Marxist or whatever. And my cohort group at Cornell, where I was hired, it's the only job I've had, that cohort group has been very, a little bit irreverent of the hallowed walls of academia. So I think that really explains why I felt a certain license to follow questions that I thought were important, whether they were professionally sanctioned or not. Now, the consequence of this is that although I was trained as an intellectual historian, and then my work in Germany was philosophy, sociology, etc., I was hired in a political science or government department, we call it at Cornell, to do political philosophy and social theory, continental philosophy, because I wrote my dissertation on some left-wing Jewish German philosophers who had to escape the Nazis in the 1930s, that is, members of the Frankfurt School. My first book was on Theodor Adorno, and the second book was on Walter Benjamin. So my work was always extremely, if you will, scholastic, because I spent so much time in archives. But my choice of questions tended to be based on politically salient issues in a contemporary context. And in that mix, I have developed, it began as a kind of necessity because one part of my brain isn't quite as good as the other. I'm better visually, I'm better with geometry than I am with algebra or with numbers. So I use visuals. And I used visuals before PowerPoint, before visual culture was acknowledged as something that one does in the academy. So all of my work is somehow not illustrated by pictures, but actually gleaned out of material representations, photographs, or just things which I then make an image of and include in published work. So it's a strange combination, and it's led me to have cross listings and also to work with graduate programs in 5 different departments on campus. So it's history of art, German studies, comparative literature, and another school, the School of Art, Architecture, and Planning, along with my home department, which is government.
Well, we overlap. I wonder if we overlapped in our time in Germany.
Oh.
I was in Münster from 73 to 74.
Yes, we would have been in Germany, not the same city.
Where were you?
Then I was in Tübingen.
Ah.
And then I went to Frankfurt after that.
I see. So I'm familiar with that time.
Yeah.
And I'm familiar with the fights that were going on
Right.
in the university between the people who put great, massive wall hangings of demands and manifestos on the walls, and these skittish little scholar types who were sort of looking over their shoulders, frightened as they saw these appear in the halls as they walked to their offices every day. I guess there's a place I'd kind of like to start. Can you say a bit about what it was like for you and what happened to you as you went to a German university in this time in which there was this kind of division between the scholars and the activists, and where the scholars had this very long tradition of archival work and very slow, careful work that they were very reluctant to let go of.
Well, in fact, it didn't quite line up like that in my own experience, because when I was in Frankfurt, Habermas was giving seminars, and so we felt we had people in the establishment who were in a certain way sympathetic to at least the more liberal readings of our concerns, of our social concerns, or the more democratic leanings. So it wasn't quite that way. I kind of think that my scholasticism comes from earlier, comes from my training even in the day school that I went to. Very conservative, traditional, not conservative intellectually, as a matter of fact, quite radical, but the idea was you learned the languages, you did the original research. My undergraduate history degree was from Vassar, and we learned, absolutely go to the primary source, take your notes. There were no computers then, you had to do it all by hand. And I have worked in some of the best libraries in the world and some of the best rare book libraries in the world. That's kind of like a part of me that in fact doesn't fit the other. It's not so much that I saw these as forces I had to combat on the outside or incorporate from the outside, as just the kind of way that I happen to evolve. I'm happy as a clam when I'm sitting in an archive. It's so, and sometimes I look around and think, should I be here? I who am interested in contemporary political emergencies, what am I doing there? I've worked in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Beinecke Library at Yale. I'm now working at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York City. All of these highly, hard to get into, under lock and key, the kind of books that you have to handle with a nice velvet thing. So I don't think in my case I saw the university split that way. What I did see was a kind of opening between academia and the real world that we lived through. You couldn't deny that to be a student was also to be engaged in some sort of politics, even if it was to refuse activism, right? It was a political location. And I don't think it is today. Matter of fact, I'm quite sure it isn't. Not in my experience.
Well, that was another point in your introductory statement I wanted to ask about. Was your absolute beginning, which is, my career could not be duplicated today.
Yeah.
Don't take me as an example of how to succeed in the current academy. Can you say a bit about how you understand what's behind that?
Well, we were irreverent. We went on strike, and some of our professors joined us. We prided ourselves in being feminists first, and then, professors of the academy. We were militantly, fearlessly not concerned. Let's get right down to the core of things. We didn't worry so much about jobs. I was there at a time when men were dropping out of graduate school and women were getting in. They were getting hired. I was hired at Cornell after they had a class action suit. So there were people who laid the groundwork for an interest in hiring women. And we felt very different about getting a job than people do today when they think, I've got to get publication in this and that journal, I have to go to the professional meetings. That wasn't how we understood ourselves or our work at all. I mean, of the cohort that came to Cornell when I went, one of them became a dean. Others became whatever, but we had a little Marxist group. We'd meet on Friday afternoons and drink beer and discuss how, how important the revolution was. I mean, it seems unreal today. And of course, we were always in demonstrations. The politics that's happening now with youth, very much connected with the Obama election, is something different. It couldn't happen the old way again, and shouldn't. And what the Obama revolution means for what goes on in the academy, I don't know. So, yeah, different. And for you?
Well, I entered philosophy with a kind of forced originality arising from a bad education, or at least a very spotty education. And I had no conventional hope, which brought me to rather the same point you came to by having, I expect, a very good conventional education and a different political landscape in front of you. So, similar things, it's utterly astonishing how many people who've been blindingly successful in their academic careers and are of approximately our age tell me that the career path they followed is not one they could possibly ever recommend, or don't try this at home is almost the disclaimer that every one of my guests of a certain age puts on the front of their vita, and it's very close to the same vita. I'd also be inclined to say that the deeply interesting guests I've had over the years have always had that, this is not a path anyone can emulate kind of premise to what they say, or preface to what they say. It's fascinating. Just to give you a little tiny bit of sort of my take on Germany when I came, I was in the opposite corner because I was hanging around with the very conservative Catholics in the university from which the current Pope came, or taught one of the universities at which he taught at one point, with Joseph Pieper, who was the great kind of comforter and protector of frightened and wounded Catholics in Germany. So I got to see the whole picture from a different angle. And that was, it was a different formative experience. There's a certain complementarity, maybe, at least in our German experiences. One thing your preliminary statement didn't quite address yet is the questions that moved you, and the kind of biography in question leading to question. Could you say a little bit about that?
It's two things and answers. I've written books on German philosophers, a book on the Soviet Union in the 1920s, a book on Islamism, a book on Hegel and Haiti. Some people are very critical of that because it seems to be moving all over the place. And indeed, having no follow-through. But in fact, I've always written the same book. So I must say there must be a driving question, if I can sort of formulate it. And it has to do with, it's kind of a reflection on the things that I lived through during my student years. How do you take the kind of utopian hope that people put into political action and deal with it if it's motivated by moral, a high ideal, let's just say, and yet always seems to have such a disastrous consequence? then how do you put together questions of metaphysics or religion, but metaphysics is really what I mean, which is beyond the present, beyond the positivist, materialist, empirical world. How do you put that together with political belief? And when does that go wrong? When does that go wrong? And how is it, we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. If we give up all kinds of utopian politics, it seems to me it's almost an impossible situation to live under. On the other hand, if we act by it, the inhumanity can be extreme. So it's really very much that kind of issue, particularly as it's played out in time, in the dimension of time, that is, as an understanding of the meaning of history, a philosophy of history. Because, we don't study history for naught. We study it because we think it shows some sort of, important revelation for what human existence is all about, whether one goes back to the last book of the Bible or goes forward to Hegel and Marx's philosophy of history.
Yeah. It's almost exactly the problem that Moshe Postolnik put in his interview a few months ago. This fascination with an ideal, this willingness to die for an ideal, and this need of the heart to have an ideal to die for.
Well, Moish was in Frankfurt when I was, so...
Oh, I see. So we've got a school going here. This is...
As a matter of fact, we both hung out in the same communes. I mean, we didn't live in the same commune, but I knew people whose commune overlapped with his commune, or he wasn't as communal, perhaps, as I was in a commune. But anyway, so that's definitely a good analogy. That one works.
Yeah. Well, I mean... the mention of commune suggests a solution that a lot of people are at least somewhat happy with, which is to build one's own kind of microculture on the model of whatever one's metaphysical beliefs may be about the ideal, and then to attempt to see how far that will propagate sort of virally in the environment, and just to trust that if that culture is resilient and has something to it, one will be doing one's bit for the larger transformations. I mean, I've got a lot of friends with metaphysical beliefs about how things are supposed to go who resolve that problem spiritually that way.
Right.
And I know that some of the green stuff in Germany is partly resolved that way. Was that a solution that appealed to you, or and how did you? What happened? Did you run into that?
I was bad on communes. First off, they're not very compatible with sitting hunched over your library notes. So that was like an existential day-to-day incompatibility. And the other is that I find collectives very tyrannical. Because the collective always speaks with the leader's voice. I've never known, even the tyranny, the closest one got to the non-leader collective was when I was at Georgetown as part of the women's feminist collective there, the feminist collective, where we would have retreats and we would be told exactly how communal we had to be. It was, there was no, it was extremely tyrannical, although very egalitarian. That doesn't appeal to me, or it didn't work for me in my own experiences.
So this question you posed a minute ago about what to do with idealism in a certain way. Are there stages in your journey answering that or addressing that? Is there a history to be told?
Yeah, but again, it was all what I backed into. I didn't have any career goals that got realized, including my job at Cornell, the only one I've had, where I was
a very, very elite club, in which Albert Einstein is one member for sure. And,
I've had very important experiences, and they have not been fundamentally academic ones. One was being part of this student movement, you could call it, in the 70s, this kind of global thing. A second one was when I got the job at Cornell, and I thought, oh my God, because I was visiting, in March with dirty snow all around. I had never been to Ithaca, and I thought, oh, I got this job. This is awful. So when I got back to Europe, where I was working for a radical think tank, I hitchhiked to Greece and went to Crete and found this unspoiled village and practically didn't come back to take my job at Cornell. And then I went back to this Cretan village for a lot of times and became a kind of ethnographic observer of the tourist indigenous clash and wrote about that. And that was important for me to kind of see slowly how these 350 people in the village, I learned Greek. My grandfather was Greek, so I had another motivation. And I learned Greek at Cornell, with the freshmen at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then I did this observation of how these traditional people responded to modernity that came in the form of tourism. That was really important for training my eye and training just the way I would observe. So that was one project. And then another project was, by accident, I went to Moscow with my scientist husband who was invited. But I found a group that was in '88. I found a group of philosophers at the Academy of Philosophy who were just opening up. This was in Glasnost, just opening up to the West. And I got, my husband didn't go back, but I went back, at least once a year, maybe twice, and we worked really closely together. I got money from all over because those times everybody was building bridges to the Soviet Union. And we did a lot of things. We brought Habermas to Moscow, Derrida to Moscow. We did a lot of things, and I wrote a book because of that. But that was an accident, right? And my book on Islamism was written a convergence of two things. One was 9/11, realizing that no one doing political philosophy in my school had any idea about political Islam as a body of thought. And the other was looking back and realizing that my dissertation advisor at Georgetown, although he had been trained at Moshe Bostoni's institution, i.e. University of Chicago, and taught me Freud and Nietzsche and Hegel and whatever, his name was Hisham Sharabi, and he was a leading scholar of Arab intellectual history. So I was in touch with him again. And then I got in with another group from Brazil that visits Muslim countries, which I've been doing now for the last 6 years, going every year to a different Muslim country with a kind of seminar group. So these things have nothing to do with being at an institution, Cornell, in political philosophy, going to the American Political Science Association meetings, nothing. But these other things have always been, in a certain way, connected to what was really going on in historical terms, either the end of the Soviet Union or the confrontation with the politicized Islam or whatever. So, or the life of the radical student in Germany. So all of that was, to me, much more interesting than professional journals.
You talk about accidents, and I'm wondering whether you've got a model of scholarly life here, and I'm wondering if you want to embrace it or if you want to call it a series of accidents. I mean, Thoreau starts off Walden by saying, I'm going to talk about myself, because he's the only person I know. And I'm going to give a report of my experiences with a clear understanding that there are 1,000 ways of dividing this thing we're going through. Well, I mean, there are scholars who embrace that accidentality. In fact, they say, look, I mean, this is the only thing I can think about, is the experiences that moved me. This is what scholarship kind of has to be, at least right now. And others who sort of embarrassedly note that while they were working along on 17th century calligraphy, they got bit by a rat and ended up writing about rabies. And, you know, I mean, you get either embarrassment or embrace.
Well, no, I really think these are two poles that are really important. I mean, for instance, when I wrote my book on Russia, on the Soviet experience, the last chapter is ethnography, very much like what I had done in Crete. But the body of the book is based on research, library books, you know, 10s and 30s of them lined up on my bed at night, you know. So this combination of scholarship of the most rigorous kind on the one hand, and then taking one's lead as far as questions are concerned from what one's actually experiencing, which, yes, is accidental, but precisely for that reason really represents what's going on in the world today. That combination is what I've found most thrilling. I find that thrilling, both sides.
Yes. I wonder if we could talk about Crete for a second.
Younger days.
Yeah, but I'm aware in feminism, which I get kind of secondhand through my spouse who studies these things hard. I mean, Greece has become a kind of second home for feminists in a very, at least a certain school of feminists in a particular way, because of a kind of mythologized history. And I know that Crete is particularly a home of that kind of heart's land, heart's ideal for people, because the Minoan stuff is if anything, a remembered past people can feel some real affection for. And then there are, of course, the cold water pouring scholars who keep coming in and say, well, Greece was nothing like this. All of this archaeology is extremely speculative. And I'm wondering how much of this Greece as the home of the heart's longings stuff came into your work with Crete.
Well, it's funny, you remind me, just a few weeks ago I was visiting my hairdresser who also spent her youth in Greece. She said, did you see Mamma Mia, the movie? She said, that could have been us. She said, I could have gone back, instead of being a hairdresser in New York, I could have gone back and run a taverna in Naxos or in Mykonos or something. So for a certain generation, that was a kind of euphoric place. It was kind of a hippie place. And for me, again, I never had this kind of spiritualism that would take me back to Minoan civilization. But I met a woman in this Cretan village who was very into that and is now in her 90s and has entrusted me with her manuscript, which when I get a couple of years, and hopefully I go back to Greece and do it, I have to work over. She's not she's an autodictat, but she's redone Linear B. And she's astounding. I think she's right. And I've tried to work with her to get it published for a long time, and the academic presses won't touch it because she went to a community college and doesn't have any of the credentials. And one of my colleagues is Martin Bernal, who wrote Black Athena. He's looked at the manuscript. He finds it quite compelling, but that isn't enough yet to... I mean, I really have got to devote a year or two of to do the scholarship that would justify it, because she hasn't had access to the libraries that I have access So, I mean, it's never been that part. I haven't been the soft, squishy type about that. I mean, like, in other words, you know what I mean? That part of spirituality, I'm much more interested in, why Eusebius justifies killing homosexuals. I'm much more interested in that than understanding, a more spiritual, affirmative notion of the religious tradition.
Now, I'm just wondering, I mean, in some ways it's sort of the contemporary goddess movement and some of the romantic stuff that gets written about experiences on pilgrimage in Greece.
Right.
Seems like such a perfect case study for this kind of the ideal being fully expressed,
Right.
and then running up against all sorts of political realities and political problems, and the folks who try to fully express that ideal get criticized for not working hard enough for the folks who are making $7 an hour at Woolworths, and
I see what you mean. Well, one thing I was really interested in this ethnography of the village was how these same Greek boys who were doing so well with the tourist buses when the girls would arrive from Stockholm or whatever, they all wanted to have a fling with a village boy. That, was part of it. If they had showed up in Stockholm or Germany, or I'm not singling out Sweden, as a guest worker, they would have been treated very differently. So I was interested in that that contextualization of the utopian meaning of that actual human being, a village boy, right? Who in one context was part of the tourist package, and on the other context was, and of course the reality was, because I stayed there long enough to learn to be what they call a καλό κορίτσι, a good girl, right? Which meant that I didn't hang out in the cafes, and I didn't hang out in the same way the tourists did with the village boys, etc. And then I realized I was staying home every night, and my life was boring as hell. So what was that about? So it was. I found it interesting to try to adapt, and then to see what it did to me as a person, and I guess it made me very, very suspicious of with something I talked about yesterday in the discussion section. Very suspicious of cultural identities, because most of them are fairly tyrannical. I mean, that's the same way I feel about communal political philosophy, and it's the same way I feel about communes, right? I don't like the pressure of being good together. I don't like that. Don't like that.
Of the folks I've talked to over the last 13 years, 14 years, you're the second only to profess a love of libraries and archives. I'm sure many other folks haven't, but that's the top of the biography, so to speak.
I was a graduate student at Georgetown, and as a not self-help job, but they had work for students, undergraduate, or students at the graduate level, and some professor from someplace in the United States couldn't get to the Library of Congress, and I was hired to go and do the work for him. And it was in the captured German documents from World War II. And they came out in cartons, cardboard cartons with numbers on them. These were documents that the people who captured the German headquarters threw into boxes. And I was supposed to go through box number 547 or whatever, and look for something. And as I was going through them, I held in my hand Hitler's mother's birthday cards to Hitler. And that did it. To kind of realize that Hitler had a mother, and that she sent him birthday cards, and that he saved them, that was hard, because for me, Hitler was the personification of evil, not a complicated historical problem, but easily there. evil, killed by his own evil acts. I still would judge his acts as evil. But it was much more complicated to acknowledge his being a little boy growing up by a mother who sent him birthday cards as an adult. And that adult saves these birthday cards from his mother, and I'm holding it in my hand. All of that was deeply moving, mysterious, puzzling, problematic, and, was the beginning of my becoming a junkie for archives, I think, because there's something in that, I don't know. But that's what I thought of when you said, this is unusual. I really think it was that kind of shiver. I mean, you get shivers from that. A kind of... I guess what also you have to face then is that this was a human being. This was not the Antichrist, or this was a human being. And so it stretches your metaphysical imagination. And there have been other times in the archive, most recently, a much less dramatic one where I'm working on manuscripts from northern Spain. There's a manuscript from 940 called the Morgan Beatus. It's a illustrated commentary on the last book of the Bible, on Revelation. Actually, it's not that one. It's a later one. It's the Aspa Beatus, but it doesn't matter. There's a picture of the place where the scribes were whom copied the commentary. And it's called a scriptorium. It's a building. It's an architectural space. And you see in this scriptorium, you see this little cubicle where two monks are like this. And as I was seeing that, I was like this in the Pierpont Morgan Library, and I thought, this is infinite regress, because I am commenting on people who were commenting on people who had commented on the last book of the Bible, right? And so what are we doing? It's a little bit scary. It may be pretty useless.
I just wanted to get your response to a story from the other person who told me about archives,
yes,
and the love of archives. And she said, probably as a graduate student, she'd gone to Spain to look at 16th century archives. She made this case for being there and was admitted, sat down with the papers. And she said the first thing she did was to begin to cry. Because 16th century unnormalized spelling and orthography, it was like she was looking at, despite the fact that she knew Spanish, it was like she was looking at a Martian text. And she was very close to giving up in that first encounter with raw stuff. And then, the sense I got from her was how, and from other people I know who've worked outside of their first language, just how slowly you need to go to get access. How painstaking a process this is, and the frustrations. And then one sees that people like Will and Ariel Durant, in the time in which you're sorting out some obscure architect in New Spain, have just finished Napoleon. How does that work for you?
You're right about the patience. And right now, I don't know what to make of my notes, and I don't know why I'm there. And the only thing that gives you faith is that it's worked before. So keep doing it. It's worked before. You've hung in there long enough to get something interesting out of it before. So just do it again. I worked on Walter Benjamin. Do you know anything about him?
A little. I know Hannah Arendt's essay on him.
Yeah. He left 1,000 pages of unpublished notes on his major work that was never written, called the Arcades Project, about the Paris arcades, the first shopping malls in the 19th century. And he used 900, some 800, that many books, sitting in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the old one, and getting these books out of the library and noting them. And I had no idea how to go about writing about his unwritten work, except to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale, take out the same books he took out, and just mimetically sit there with them and hope that something happened.
Again, looking over the shoulder of somebody who's looking over the shoulder. Again, okay.
Oh my, isn't it? It's kind of pathetic. But anyway, I got some really interesting things out of it. Like, you would think maybe he would have cited the lead topic sentence. You know how you're taught to read books? Mm-hmm. No, it would be like, way in the back, one little thing that seemed totally trivial, given the intent of the author who wrote the book. And then you realized, okay, he's not interested in the intent of the author who wrote the book. He's interested in something else. And if you follow that, then you could make some progress. But if I hadn't just mechanically done that in this mimetic fashion, I never would have gotten anywhere with that project. So there's a certain kind of daily boredom that I tolerate well. Daily boring repetition of work. I'm not bored doing it, but it looks boring, and I'm somewhat apologetic. And I wish I was Will Durant. I'm sure he made more money out of his profession than I have, or more fame, or more something. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the great discovery you have to make as a graduate student, if you're going to amount to anything, is, the first time you realize that a rather glib general treatment is just wrong.
Yeah.
You have to see that enough times to realize that all of the general treatments are just wrong at some level.
And they're the ones we teach up to through high school. We teach only wrong.
And I think beyond in college, whenever you have to handle the 19th century in a semester, you teach it badly in a certain way. You almost have to, because the alternative would be to give people the bug for archives, the bug for the real research, and passing that on is a very much harder job than telling people the story of philosophy, to use one of Will Durant's titles. But that does get us right to teaching. And I guess I want, given who you are and what you do, what happens when you get into a classroom?
I think the undergraduates don't quite get it. I think they want something more packaged. I taught for my most successful course as an undergraduate course was a big lecture course in visual culture and social theory, which talked about, it began with from the time of photography on, what happens when images get imbricated into culture in ways that had been, that literateness was really the entry into culture, let's say during the Enlightenment. And by the end of the 19th century, visual culture becomes an extremely important record of cultural history, cultural life. And I taught a course that dealt with various moments, beginning with the Paris arcades, the first shopping malls, and going through Soviet constructivism and how that was a kind of art into life, compared to Jugendstil or Art Nouveau's art into life, and then moving into the protest art of the 1960s, and then this kind of art after art of the visual media today. That was kind of the course. And here's the thing, unfortunately I did it when we were still taking images in slides, not digital. And so I have 2,000 slides, all of which would have to be transcribed into digital to keep the thing going, and I was really bad about putting the titles on the slides. So I'd have to do it myself because it matches the lectures that I had. The images do. If I were to do a digital variant of that same course. So I sort of lost it. But that was very popular for undergraduates, very popular. It was cross-listed in multiple courses, and they loved it. But since that time, I haven't reached that level of appeal for the undergraduates. Graduates, I think, thrive because I'm very rigorous as a scholar. So I'm tough in that regard. And yet, totally open to wacko questions. And my students are not molded in my image. There's my own dissertation advisor, my Hisham Sharabi dissertation advisor, didn't speak German. And I was working on unpublished manuscripts in German. He didn't speak German. So he was always my ideal of a dissertation advisor, which is totally enthusiastic, very much trusting, and totally ignorant themselves, so they couldn't one-up you and top you. And I love it when I'm in that kind of situation with a really gifted graduate student, and we do have wonderful graduate students at Cornell, where they don't need me to tell them the content. They only need me to tell them whether the content is being conveyed, whether they're contradicting themselves. In other words, I can trust them and trust their originality, and they're just, then they're a delight. Then they're really a delight. And I work with a lot of them, maybe 20 right now.
Can you say a little bit about the origins of this interest in visual culture?
Isn't it nice you ask me questions about me? I'm sorry, I'm just thinking how pleasant an experience this is, and I'm realizing it's pretty self-centered. Well, gee, you're asking about me. Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
Well, we're producing the archives that your granddaughter is going to be looking at.
Okay. I forgot your question. You said, could you...
I'm interested in the origins in you and your spirit, your scholarly work of this interest in visual culture.
Well, I come into it with an apology, which is I'm not so good on the one. My husband is this mathematician of great competence, and but he can't spell porch, P-O-R-T-C-H, right? So we're good together. But I'm very good, geometrically. I'm very good topologically. I can do that kind of thing really, really well. And part of that is seeing patterns. Seeing analogies, like one of the images in my book on the Soviet Union is King Kong on top of the Empire State Building and Lenin on top of a Gothic structure of architecture, and they are lookalikes, and they actually have some connection. But, for me, it's the images that kind of lead to the thought. And it's just the way my mind worked. When I was going for tenure, I kind of wrote about how I thought you could do philosophy visually, and you could use Escher prints to show the dialectic and everything, and I handed it in as part of my dossier, and the word out of the department was flaky. So that was not the reason I got tenure in the government department at Cornell University. But it's actually the reason that I'm interesting to a lot of people outside of the academy, like artists read my stuff.
Well, one thing I've just sort of touched the hem of a little bit in thinking about some things, is that various people, like for instance the Nazis, who were trying to build an ideal world, are very explicitly making reference to visual traditions. They're talking the language of ideal visual traditions. They're making their statements in those terms. And the United States, when it enters the First World War especially, is making the posters in every post office are making its statement in visual terms, and in visual terms that require one seeing the Hall of Mirrors going back, when one needs to see all the images they're citing, to understand why it is they say that. So I mean, in some ways, would almost be scholarly negligence to leave that stuff out.
Yeah, but boy, is the Academy prejudiced toward the word, and that's a modernity issue, right? Literacy, public school education, all of that. You have to be able to read, write, and arithmetic. Those are the three things that made you modern, right? But if you go before even the 18th century, but particularly before 1453 and the Gutenberg Bible or the printing press invention or what, I may be a little bit wrong, but you know what I'm talking about, the mid-15th century, the beginning of print as we know it today. If you go before that, it's all visual. And I think we're going into, because of globalization, we're going into a space where a cartoon of the prophet, for instance, could go around the globe and be read visually, even if it's read totally out of context. So visuals have a very different kind of, I was going to say ontology, which is really an unnecessarily philosophical word, but they're of a different nature than text. And they're very suspect in the Academy. And of course, there is the manipulative image, which can be done by the government or advertising or, a lot of other places where either politicians or corporations manipulate us through the image. Right? But there's also an empowering image. And I'm not one who would dump on all of popular culture. I think that there is an empowering image depending on how open the reception is and whether you can whether you can change its meaning through your reception of it, or whether it becomes a way of closing down meaning and saying things only mean what the maker of the image says, whether it is a way of leading you one place or whether you can play with it.
And that's the distinction you want to make between manipulation
and empowerment. Else. And I think it happened in the last election with the image of Obama. I think it drove the campaign nuts because they couldn't control the image. And yet the lack of control of Obama's image was precisely what made it powerful as a grassroots organizing phenomenon. And there's this case now with Shepard Fairey and his use. He made the poster that then became so famous of Obama, but he made it with an image done by a reporter, a photographer, who's fine with the fact, but Associated Press that owns the copyright to that image is not fine with that fact. So you have these varying power appropriations of the image. But I think the fact that things do get recontextualized increases their power. And the cool thing about images that can be replicated without any loss of quality now digitally is that they increase their value by being shared. All ideas do. All ideas increase their value by being shared. But the image is kind of an instantaneous proliferation of appropriations and reappropriations and recontextualizations. And it doesn't stop at the language barrier of a nation state. I think that's really exciting.
So, the image in the age of digital reproduction.
Yes, correct.
Yes. So, I have now this romantic picture of you working in archives and looking over literally the shoulders of scholars who are looking over the shoulders of scholars who are looking over the shoulders of scholars, going, 4 levels deep. And now I think I'm trying to get a picture of how you work as a scholar when what you have is an image, where it's not the same. This wonderful story of, pulling out all the books that Walter Benjamin looked at and thinking about those. What's it like when what you have to work on is an image?
Neuroscience talks about the imagination as a capacity to produce analogies, between a memory and a perception. So, if you see an image, perceive it, it evokes analogies of images in the past. And imagination is the putting together, the juxtaposition of them, and then they resonate. So most of my image use is juxtaposed, two together, two opposed to each other, two resonating with each other, because they're both alike and not alike. King Kong and Lenin. You know, they're both images that appeal to the masses, to a mass public. They're both done in 1933, within 6 months of each other. The people who did King Kong, I mean, it was at the time Stalin was very interested in Hollywood. So it's not just me, but it's also Stalin who is, you know what I'm saying? There's all this way that these things resonate, and there's something about the non-identical but similar nature of a juxtaposition of images that sets the mind really creatively whirring in interesting ways.
I'm sure there are visual artists who work with juxtapositions of images, and all they need to care about is whether they like the juxtaposition, whether it seems to do something powerful. Are you under some stricter rules as a scholar when you juxtapose?
Well, I guess my questions that I ask of the image are different. I'm thinking, for instance, of the Brillo pad, the famous Brillo pads that Andy Warhol is a very, very key figure, because he does it a different way. It takes the same thing, the Brillo pad box, right, or Campbell's soup can, and puts it in a frame of art, but it's still the same thing. So he takes art and commodity and puts them together in ways where they're supposed to be held apart. So he makes you have to think those categorical distinctions differently. And when I put King Kong and Lenin next to each other, I mean, that whole book is about, the subtitle is called Dream World and Catastrophe, the Passing of Mass Utopia in East and West, is that the Soviet Union was a utopia of production, and the United States produced a utopia of consumption. But they were both mass cultures. And so rather than see them as antithetical others, which is the Cold War narrative, I want to put them together in ways that make them look surprisingly similar. I'm very interested, and that's the philosophical thing, is to take concepts that are held apart and begin to pull down those walls that separate them, because politically I think that's what makes us turn into us and them, friend and enemy, good guy and bad guy. And that's what legitimates the violence that we do to each other.